start, and then we can really plunge into Byomkesh. And yeah, so well, a very good morning to today's discussion, and this is a discussion I have a lot of interest in, primarily because I've been such a great fan of Sharadindu Bandyopadhyay over the last so many years, and September marks exactly 50 years since Sharadindu passed away, and the Byomkesh Bakshi series still goes strong in both the textual as well as the visual media. Now, Sharadindu, of course, published the first Byomkesh stories in 1931-32. Right. He was born in Bihar, and from a very early age started writing. Sharadindu talks about his fascination with the detective fiction from an early age. He was an avid reader of Edgar Allan Poe, Sherlock Holmes, Agatha Christie, and therefore it was quite natural that he would gravitate towards trying to write detective fiction. But he has really been underestimated in Bangla literature a lot, because Sharadindu wrote across a wide spectrum. He was one of the few writers to have actually tried the detective story and the ghost story together. And that is why later on we shall be doing the Byomkesh or Baroda story, which will bring in an interface between the detective story and the ghost story, as it were. Now, the second thing that you need to know, that Sharadindu also wrote a number of historical romances, and these were very popular also, most important being Kaler Mondira and the other stories. Now, apart from that, Sharadindu wrote a lot of romances as well. Also, Sharadindu experimented with writing for children, especially the Sadashiv stories, basing them in Maharashtra. And you'll have to remember that for a long period, Sharadindu was actually based in Maharashtra. So in that sense of the term, he initially started writing the Byomkesh stories. They were published in Doinik Boshumati for some time. And then after a few years, he stopped writing them. And then when he returned, he went to Bombay to try writing screenplays, came back to Kolkata, and was requested by sons and daughters of his friends to write the Byomkesh stories once again. And so after 16 long years, he started writing these stories once again. So like Conan Doyle, there was a brief interval, right, in which he did not try the Byomkesh stories. And then, of course, he went back and started writing them. Now, therefore, what I'm trying to suggest is that Sharadindu was a writer who, like Conan Doyle, was interested in the occult. He was writing ghost stories and short stories and the detective stories at the same time. And the Byomkesh stories were only part of a greater corpus of writings that he did. In fact, when we come to the question of genre and the question of adaptation of the detective stories, we will come to look at what Sharadindu exactly calls them. Now, I will discuss these stories in three classes. Today, I will specifically talk about Sharadindu and his indigenization of the Indian detective story, or the Bengali detective story. In my next class, I will take up the Inquisitor in greater detail. I'll talk about the Inquisitor today a little bit. And in the third lecture, I will talk about Byomkesh or Baroda, following which I will probably discuss a few issues and follow up in the fourth discussion. Right. Now, it is interesting that Sharadindu's first story was published in 1932-33. So this is the time period when he has already read Conan Doyle, read Agatha Christie, But what is exactly the tradition of the Bengali detective story? That is something which we will have to also discuss. Now, the Bengali detective story is a byproduct actually of the English detective story. It's a kind of a colonized form. Now, what we have initially in the Bengali canon is the stories of thieves and dacoits, ডাকাতের গল্প, and you have stories like Jhanu Chor Chanu and so on and so forth. So the thief was considered to be intelligent in certain stories, but also the ways of committing crime were very primitive. You had the thieves sort of burrowing into mud houses, sheet kata jetake bolto, and you had the dacoits, ঠগির গল্প, who would waylay the people on the road and rob them, or they would announce and come as either as rakshasas, or they would be great social servants who would rob the rich and help the poor. But the nature of crime was very restricted in certain ways. Now, what happened is, with the rise of Kolkata as the great metropolis of the British Empire, and please do take that concern of our Chief Minister of transforming Kolkata into London, because Kolkata was actually at one point of time a replica of London. If you walk by Strand Road and you walk by London's Thames Bank, you will find that there are a lot of similarities. The warehouses, the customs house where I used to work at one point of time was almost a replica of the customs house of London. Now, therefore, with these similarities, there was a lot of economic activity, as you can understand, in Kolkata itself. Therefore, it increased phenomenally. The East India Company and the rise of Calcutta, the rise of the Indians, traders who went to Kolkata. There was a huge influx of people who traveled by the river. Remember, the railways had not yet come. So people traveled by the rivers, especially the Ganga, the Ganges, to travel to Kolkata. Along with, what is important in our Inquisitor is that Kolkata also became a center for the opium trade. And the opium trade, the opium was grown all across the banks of the Ganges. Patna, for example, you had the Uttar Pradesh opium fields, poppy fields as it were. And this opium was processed and carried to Kolkata, from which they would be sent off on schooners and small ships to go to China. And therefore, there was a significant amount of Chinese people who came to Kolkata also. And this was where, around Teriti Bajar, which is in the middle section of Kolkata, you had something called China Bajar. Now, I know this very well because I started off my career as an inspector. I was an excise inspector, and my office was close to a place close to Teriti Bajar and Naz Cinema Hall. So I have actually seen these small Chinese eateries, Chinese shoe shops, which still have a presence. But at this point of time, China was this destination for opium. So there was a lot of Chinese who came to Kolkata, and this China Bajar became a site of a lot of crime. The second thing that happened was, because so many people traveled, there were institutions that started growing up. In Kolkata, around Khidirpur dock, for example, there was numerous bastis which sprouted. Around Chitpur yard, which was a huge place where people loaded and unloaded a lot of material. There was a lot of production, trade. There was a significant influx of people from all across India. Finances increased. You will remember that the Tagores made their money sort of interacting with the British. a lot of these Bengali traders were becoming very rich. A lot of people settled in Kolkata, and Kolkata started ballooning at its seams. But remember that it was not Calcutta, central Calcutta. To a certain extent, the southern fringes were starting to develop. Therefore, the location of the Byomkesh stories is very important. It is bang in the middle of this economic activity, Harrison Road. And the site of our first story, The Inquisitor, which is a very bad title according to me, I will call it Truth Seeker or Shottanneshi, Shotto Anneshon, or the search for truth. I will call it the Truth Seeker. Now, the site of this story is also in this part of China Bazar, which is again mid Calcutta. So, two or three things. One is that the detective story comes via England. There's no parallel in Bangla literature. Secondly, there is a significant influx of trading and economic activity post the East India Company in 19th century Bengal. There are institutions which mimic the British institutions and crop up. Due to economic activity, there's a lot of settlement and a lot of concurrent crime, financial crime, crimes of passion, because there's such a strong underworld which is also building up. I've also pointed out how opium becomes one of the lucrative business centering around Kolkata. The destination of opium is China, and that there is a significant amount of the Chinese diaspora who are thereby coming and settling in Kolkata, participating in this trade. And China Bazar becomes a site which is seedy, which is poor, and which is extremely riddled with crime. In fact, the drug that is going to be sorted out in this story is cocaine, right? And cocaine and opium, these were the two major drugs which were being sort of transacted across Kolkata at this point of time. So this is Kolkata in the 1930s. Sharadindu in his interview categorically suggests that he was brought up reading the Conan Doyle stories, and he also borrowed copiously from Agatha Christie stories. Remember this, that all the major Bengali writers borrowed from their Western counterparts. Now, who were the writers? The first major writer of Bengali detective fiction was somebody called Pachkori De, and his detective was called Devendra Bijoy. Now, Devendra Bijoy comes back in Sharadindu's interviews once and a few times. In fact, Byomkesh also has this, brief exchange with Ajit, where Ajit asks, who is the murderer? Hottakari ke? And Byomkesh says, Pachkori De, right? The Pachkori De is the murderer. So Pachkori De and Devendra Bijoy, these are the first major, Pachkori De is the first major detective writer. But interestingly, something called the police procedural would come up in Bengal in the late 19th century. And this happened through a series of stories which were written by a man called Priyonath Mukhopadhyay, who was writing Darogar Daptar. Darogar Daptar, the Daptar of the Daroga. Daroga would be the inspector. And these would be the records of sensational crimes, true crimes, that he had interacted while, in his career as an inspector. There was also another text which was called Bakaullah's Diaries, and they too had these tales of sensational crime. So crime became, as it were, a fascination for the Bengali intellectual middle class. Now, why did this crime become so important? Because, for the Bengali middle class, these were very novel experiences. This did not happen earlier, one. Secondly, due to print culture and the influx of newspapers, they were quickly dispersed across the city. And thirdly, there was this question about safety, about the new ways in which the younger generation was changing in the under the onslaught of colonialism. So crime became a subject of discourse in the Bengali uh, novelistic arena. Now, also important for you is to understand that there was a significant growth of print culture in the late 19th century. Now, therefore, there arose this entire institution of Bengal's Grub Street, where cheap print was produced and consumed. These were sensational narratives, pornographic narratives, these were yellow journalisms, and these became consumed in great quantities. The place from which this cheap print culture arose was Bottala, and gradually over the next 50 years they would be circulated in and around Bottala. Bottala is, of course, close to College Street and is on slightly ahead of College Street, and you can well understand that this place became a place for cheap print culture. Now, also important is the rise of several magazines which started publishing these stories, several daily newspapers. In fact, Byomkesh reads the newspaper called the Boshumati, Doinik Boshumati, the Daily Boshumati, which becomes one of the most important newspapers of the period. And the Byomkesh stories were published in the Boshumati. So you see, the first 3 stories at least of Byomkesh were published in Boshumati and garnered a lot of attention. So 1932, Sharadindu decides that I will try my hand on with a detective story in Bangla. And up comes the first story. Incidentally, although this is the first story in the collected works, Shottanneshi, Truth Seeker or Inquisitor, whatever you call it, was not the first story. It was Pother Kata, right? It was Pother Kata. Pother Kata can be translated as the gramophone phone mystery, where there's this insurance agent. This is man who poses as an insurance agent and is a murderer for hire and fires gramophone pins into the hearts of people on the streets while tinkling a cycle bell. Very sensational, very original. But, the first Byomkesh story to be published, 1932. The next story to be published is, of course, Shimonto Hira. Now, this is again the story of the stealing of a diamond and Byomkesh's effort to bring it back. And it is then that Sharadindu felt that he had to create a prehistory of the detective. The narrator, of course, was Sharadindu's own Watson, or Byomkesh's own Watson, Ajit Bandopadhyay, the writer. Therefore, Sharadindu felt that he needed to introduce Byomkesh. He needed to introduce the friendship of Byomkesh and Ajit and place them in context, and therefore came around to writing the first Byomkesh story, as it were, in the sequence, and that is Shottanneshi, Truth Seeker, Inquisitor, whatever you may call it. Right. Now, it is interesting that, in his introduction to Sharadindu's Byomkesh stories, he talks about Byomkesh's name. That's the first thing that we need to talk about. Why Byomkesh? Right? Who is Byomkesh? Now, Byomkesh, very interestingly, belongs to a Kayastha family. Now, you see, this caste, there's a lot of talk about this caste hierarchies in Sharadindu's interviews. And I am placing this just because, this has been talked about. Sharadindu was suggesting that the Kayasthas were more, in a certain way, intelligent than the Brahmins. Byomkesh's father is a mathematician and was a school teacher, was interested in Shankho logic. Therefore, there's a distinct Indian mathematical tradition that he derives his logic from. And his mother is a Vaishnava lady, right? The Vaishnavas were supposed to be well-read, intelligent, and therefore there is a combination of an Eastern intellectual tradition, right? This is the way in which the detective is being indigenized. Eastern detective tradition, where, there is the combination of the logic and mathematics of ancient India with the interface with the Vaishnava tradition of faith and intelligence through Byomkesh's parents. There's also this very interesting thing that Byomkesh is educated in the university. When we come to know him in 1932, he's around 23, 24, has just passed out from the university. Therefore, he has had training in Western education as well. This is very characteristic of the Bengal Renaissance, as it were, where you see there is this interface of the Eastern and the Western tradition. So Byomkesh, in that sense, is a man of the East, situated in the education of the East and the West, and writing or practicing a profession that is very Western, right? So this interface of the East and West is something you should concentrate on. Now, very interestingly also, Byomkesh talks about his introduction to detection, and he says that this is purely something which he started as a kind of a hobby and not really as a profession, although gradually Byomkesh starts receiving fees and becomes a professional, right? You remember in this particular story, Shottanneshi, or the truth seeker, he is volunteering before the police commissioner to help them solve the crime. He is not paid to do so, right? Now, where does the term Byomkesh comes from? Byomkesh, of course, refers to Shiva, right? The god Shiva, and the association with Shuttam, Shivam, Sundaram. So there's this association between Shiva and the truth, and therefore Byomkesh is like Shiva, who is going to be the embodiment of truth, the seeker of the truth. Also, very importantly, Bakshi refers to this concept of bakshish, or fees. So it's an interesting thing, isn't it? There's a religious connotation there with truth, which is beautiful, and truth, which is Shiva, and also truth, which will bring a certain fee and provide a certain occupation. Sharadindu, of course, said that he had to give a catchy phrase, a catchy name to his detective. Therefore, he chose upon Byomkesh Bakshi as a sensational name. Now, I've already suggested that Byomkesh is situated in Harrison Road, which is College Street, Amherst Street, right in the middle of Kolkata. Initially, they meet at a mess, and this was very common. You see, another very important thing that, and now I come to this question of genre, that Sharadindu suggested, is that these were not only detective stories, they were also contemporary social pictures. So Sharadindu was trying to picturize contemporary Kolkata and Bengali culture as it was. And very importantly, this mess culture was part and parcel of the urban Kolkata culture of the 1930s. You see, these are people who are all coming from the villages with some education, working as clerks in different offices. And when they work in different offices, they do not have this entire money to support their families. Therefore, they start creating messes where they all congregate together, do their marketing themselves, hire a cook, and send the extra money that they earn back home, right? The mess culture, of which, if you remember Uttam Kumar's film Sade Chuvhattor, this is a recurrent phenomenon. And the Bengali as an emasculated clerk, somebody who works for the East India Company offices and so on, is a picture which is continually repeated in the contemporary social novels of the period. In my childhood, I remember reading a tear-jerker of a play called Keranir Jibon, the person who slogs for his family at the office and dies an ignominious death. Also important is the characterization of the Bengali as slightly effeminate but extremely intelligent. You will remember that the Bengali was never seen as an extremely robust individual. He was seen as suffering from all sorts of diseases, especially of the stomach, of the gastroenterical variety, and therefore, but marked very significantly by a propensity to education and application of education. Therefore, Byomkesh is the quintessential Bengali detective in that sense of the term. He has a sharp nose, is reasonably slightly built, and extremely intelligent to look at, and he operates by his brain. He's never really a super sleuth, although in this particular story he punches the doctor in the face when he's about to murder Byomkesh. Right. Now this therefore is the setting, the middle class Kolkata, and the culture of the mess, the city teeming with thousands of people, a seat of economic activity and crime. Therefore, the Byomkesh Bakshi stories are to be seen also as a representation of contemporary urban Kolkata of the period. Now, after the 10th book in the story Arthamarthartham, where we have the access to Byomkesh's biographical details, Byomkesh also marries. Now, this is again a major departure. You do not have very many married detectives in English fiction, but Byomkesh marries, and his wife is also called Shottobati, right? So once again, Shotto, the truth, becomes a running motive in the Byomkesh Bakshi stories, and that is why he calls himself the Shottan Nishi, or the truth seeker. Truth is a very important category in detective fiction that we have already seen in our course. Now, very interestingly is that Byomkesh also later on we will find is a very deeply familial man. He has a kid, and Byomkesh and Shottobati have very frequent domestic quarrels, therefore providing a kind of a picture of a Bengali household where you have the husband and the wife and the brother-in-law, as it were. Ajit comes to live with them in Harrison Road, and you have a servant called Putiram, who is not read. If you remember, in one of his stories, he identifies the taxi number because he reads it as 8008. I'm sorry, 4004 rather than 8008. Now, it is interesting that after after these stories, there is this long gap of 16 years, and Sharadindu comes back once again in the story Chitrachor. And it's interesting also that he starts combining various kinds of fictions within the detective story. I've of course talked about Byomkesh of Baroda, where the detective interacts the ghost hunter. There's one story called the Shoilo Rahosyo, where there is the presence of the paranormal in the detective fiction. In fact, a ghost tries to provide a clue to the detective. There's Durga Rahosyo again, which inculcates or initiates a historical fictional dimension into detective fiction. Therefore, what I think Sharadindu was doing here is, because he was trying in his hand, and he was established as a fiction writer with a lot of forms. He was bringing in these various generic elements into detective fiction, thereby widening the scope of detective fiction. Now, in one of his interviews, the first interview with which he sort of, or the preface to his novels, he made two important statements. The first is that these were not copied, but they were original. Now, there's a slight fudging of the truth here. Some of his stories, the ideas came from the Western novels, but yes, he was creating an original interface, or he was adapting them with great originality. That much we can say. The second thing that Sharadindu says, and this is something which I find very interesting, is that he claims that people do not take detective fiction seriously. They do not consider them as literature. But he says, if Conan Doyle could write it, then why not me? I consider them very serious literature. So Sharadindu is unique in this way that he is writing adult detective stories for an adult audience with the assumption that this is a serious literary form. Now, why do I say, and why do I bring this debate? Because the contemporary major literatures, none of them really practice the detective story. In fact, I was trying to find out if the great icon of Bangla literature, Rabindranath, actually made any references to detective fiction in his letters. He, of course, has this story called The Detective, and there are puzzles and Guptadhans, hidden treasures. But Rabindranath is very skeptical about the figure of the detective, of the Bengali detective, as it were, and therefore we can understand that detective fiction was seen as largely lowbrow popular literature rather than mainstream literature. It is Sharadindu, of course, who brings into detective fiction a kind of a literary value. And these are stories which are not merely stories of crime, therefore they become testaments of contemporary social history. This is very important. I've, of course, talked about Kolkata of the contemporary period. I have talked about, and Sharadindu talks about the changing faces of Kolkata also. He talks about the riots that take place. He talks about the independence struggle. In fact, you will remember one of his characters is let go on, criminals is let go on Independence Day because, Byomkesh wants to give him a new start. Sharadindu refers to the Bhatiyas. Sharadindu refers to the influx of the Biharis and the Oriyas who come to Kolkata and choose different professions. And therefore, it is a cosmopolitan Kolkata that he's talking about, teeming with economic activity and crime. Now, he's also, of course, talking about the opium trade. He's talking about the Chinese. It does not directly talk about the Chinese, but the Chinese surroundings in China Bazar. And he will talk about, a lot of the travel that the Bengali detective initiates. And the travels are to places where Bengalis would travel for, reinvigorating themselves. These were health spots like Madhupur, Giridih. They would travel to Munger, and Sharadindu's detective, of course, travels from Kolkata to these suburban areas of the different parts of India. In fact, Byomkesh is very often sort of called for by the police commissioner to solve the crimes. Therefore, he holds quite a rapport with the British police commissioner, at least in the initial part of the stories. So it is in this sense that we see from the Byomkesh Bakshi stories a picture of urban Kolkata emerging slowly, passing through history. And therefore, this is the originality, where the detective is not situated outside his society, but the detective grows with contemporary history, and that he is enmeshed in these historical events. I'll come to this point a little later when I discuss the themes. Now, I have talked about the tradition of the detective story. You will, of course, remember that it is at this point of time that another major writer starts to experiment with detectives and explorers, and that is Dinen Rai. And Dinendranath also brings in the Jayanto Manik stories. Dinendranath, of course, talks about more active, younger detectives who engage in a lot of physical movement. There's, of course, also Bibhuti Bhushan writing Chander Pahar and the exploration of the Bengali man across the length and breadth of the world. So gradually, you see, what is happening is that there is the emergence of the Bengali young man who is eager to come into contact with the world. Now, in the Byomkesh stories, the geographical span is not very much, but it is, as it were, the young Bengali individual who is maturing gradually and who is trying to come in contact with various kinds of experience. Now, this opening up of the horizon of ideas and the horizon of the geographical expanse of the Bengali young man is something which, of course, will be related with the Indian interaction with the West. You will remember that travel becomes a very important part of the of the Indian and the Bengali mind, and travel writing is another genre that emerges in a very big way during this period. Right. Now let me consider, how does this process of indigenization take place? How does the detective become Indian? How does the detective, and when I say Indian here, I will probably use it synonymously with the Bengali, because I'm not so aware of any fictional writing based on detective fiction which is happening outside Bengal. That might be purely my lack of knowledge. Now, I have divided this for my convenience into several subheadings. The setting, for example, the setting, as I pointed out, urban Kolkata, the middle part of Kolkata, Harrison Road, China Bajar. Later on, of course, Byomkesh moves with his wife to the new house in Keatala. So you can see that, there is this shift from North Calcutta to South Calcutta as now developing. Right. There is a reference to independence. There's a reference to the riots. There's reference to Kolkata passing through turmoil. There are very important social markers. For example, in Quicksand or Chorabali, Byomkesh comes into contact with the zamindar in which story you have the theme of the widow who has given birth to a child. So there's this illegitimate children of the widows and the condition of the widows which come in. You have the reference, of course, to all classes. In fact, Byomkesh's there is a significant amount of clients of Byomkesh who are the Kumars, who are zamindars, and therefore Sharadindu is referring to the dying aristocracy and their dwindling, as it were, importance in Bengali society at the point of time, but they are still there. There's also this reference to the Babu culture. For example, in the first story, which I've already talked about, Pother Kata or the gramophone mystery, the person who survives is Ashu Babu, who is who's an old bachelor who has this mistress who's also a singer, right? So the Babu culture of, the elite Bengali Bhadralok actually having a mistress who is either a Nach girl or somebody who sings for him is referred to obliquely. There are, of course, references to the British arms which circulate in Bengal during this point of time. You remember this character of Batul Sardar, who is a vendor of arms, of these illegal arms. So, therefore, you have, on the one hand, the traditional Indian societies, and on the other hand, you also have the newer professionals. For example, Prafullo Rai, who is the killer in the gramophone mystery, gramophone pin mystery, is somebody who poses as an insurance agent. Therefore, this concept of the insurance is something which is very Western once again. The mess, again, is a Western concept where people are coming to Kolkata to partake in colonial, in the activity of the colonial East India Company and staying in messes, right? So this is the indigenization of the setting that happens. I have, of course, reminded you that the detective will travel to settings outside Kolkata, and these will be in Maharashtra, this will be in Bihar, for example, where the urban detective will bring urban logic to solve these crimes. Banaras becomes a center for one of these stories, if you remember. Now, importantly, the second theme that I have categorized is the detective, Byomkesh, Bakshi. It's interesting, isn't it, that while Hemen Rai uses Jayanto and Manik, which are very common names, Pachkori De uses the name Devendra Bijoy, right, which is almost a kind of a very heroic name. Sharadindu uses Byomkesh Bakshi. Nihar Ranjan uses the term Kiriti. So, in a certain way, all of them are trying to indigenize the name of the detective. Somebody who's related also mythically, as well as, in a way, culturally with the tradition of Indian truth-seeking, and also they are in a certain way also Western, because they have knowledge of poisons, they have knowledge of post-mortem reports. Therefore, university-educated young detectives who are not super sleuths. Kiriti Rai, of course, is very Western, smokes a pipe. But all these characters, Jayanto, Manik, Byomkesh, all of them are university-educated. They are willing to encounter a variety of experience, but they're quintessentially Bengali, as it were. They wear the dhoti and the Punjabi, as it were, the kameez, and in their dress, in their use of the Bengali language, they are extremely indigenized. Byomkesh, of course, smokes a Charminar. He sort of uses the matchboxes which are manufactured locally. In fact, in one of these stories, you will remember that the matchbox is substituted, and they refer to the matchbox with somebody who's has the mark is a Swadeshi mark. So, of course, contemporary references come in a very big way. But interestingly, you see, very interestingly, is that there are no references, as it were, to freedom fighters. This entire freedom struggle seems to be obliterated from the initial Byomkesh Bakshi stories, at least. Now, why this happens is a matter of conjecture. In fact, you see, one of the reasons might have been that Sharadindu did not want, to talk about the bombings, the criminal, the activity, the violent activities of the freedom fighters. Rather, he was talking about, he wanted to keep it conservative and talk about urban crime and the crime of the middle class. So that is one important omission, I would say, in the Byomkesh Bakshi stories. So in terms of attire, in terms of the cigarette that smokes, in terms of the matchboxes used, they are all indigenized. Very importantly, also indigenized in terms of character. You remember Ogniban being the story where an Indian scientist is the man to discover and explore a poison which cannot be traced, and he therefore tries to murder his wife, but ironically, his children die instead, right? So the Indian scientist becomes a character in the story. If you remember Chitrachor, you have a gamut of characters whom you can identify very easily. The bank manager, who is the criminal who tries to steal the money, Amoresh Raha. You have the magistrate with one eye, Ushanath Babu, right? You have the drunken Falguni, for example. You have the Zamindar, for example. So it's a corpus of characters who you would identify, and it is in this choice of setting and character, I would say, that the novels become extremely indigenized. In fact, in terms of crime, I would say they largely hark back to the Western traditions, because the storylines, Sharadindu said, it took from Western novels mainly, and also some news items from contemporary newspapers. Right. Now, once again, Byomkesh as the quintessential Bengali, domesticated with a wife and a child, reads the Bosumati, smokes the Charminar, wears the dhoti, and generally talks about in terms of metaphors that are all identifiable to the Bengali audience. Right. In fact, also in Durga Rahasya, or the Fourth Mystery, Byomkesh one of the characters is a historian, is an eminent Indian historian who talks about how there is this conflict and how the entire gold is being stored, melted and stored. Right. His journal becomes a very important a motive in the story, and Mohanlal, the canon, becomes a character in itself. There are references, of course, to the riots in Bengal. Ajit travels and meets Fazlu Mia in Patna, of course, and Byomkesh is, of course, referring to the terrible riots in and around Bihar and Noakhali, and both of them embrace and they say, "You cut my throat," and he says, "You cut my throat too." And there are stories where Sharadindu is trying to suggest how the fabric of Indian society has been rent apart by these riots. Right. Now, I would very interestingly, one of the criminals, Probal, in Shajarur Kata, is actually a very eminent Rabindra Sangeet artist. Now, this is very interesting. Onukul Babu, who is the doctor here, the homeopath doctor, once again, homeopathy is something which comes across in a very big way in urban Kolkata. It's another sort of fad of the Bengali people at this point of time, movement from the Kobiraji to the homeopath. Now, Onukul Babu, the Rabindra Sangeet singer, you have Monilal in Durga Rahasya, all these appear to be very timid, extremely what I will call commonplace Bengali individuals. But once they are discovered, they are called what we will call in Bengali Gordho Chorma Brito Singh, or the lion which wears the skin of an ass, right? Or the lion which wears the skin of a timid animal. Now, why is this important? Why do I mention this? Because I would suggest that Sharadindu is trying to point out that despite their timidness and their what we will call apparent effeminacy, within every individual there lurks a deep criminal underside, which can be exposed in times of greed and in times of, extreme stress. Now, one of these characters, if you remember in one of the stories, is murdering a blackmailer. Is murdering a blackmailer. And why? Because this blackmailer had actually killed or abducted his own son, and Byomkesh lets him go. Right. So this movement from Dhaka to Kolkata, and the ensuing, latent violence that was part of the partition, and that was embedded within every possible latent Bengali or whatever, wherever, is something that Sharadindu is exploring. So the term, the lion couched in the skin of an ass or a donkey is something which is a very significant phrase. in a certain way, Sharadindu is exploring the violent underside of the Bengali Bhadralok, as it were, something which has never really been talked about. We talk about the intellectual power of the Bhadralok. We talk about the Bhadralok's ability to sort of be casteist and extremely parochial. But the Bhadralok's ability to be violent is something that Sharadindu explores in certain ways. Now, there is, of course, so once again, from Rabindra Sangeet to riots, from Charminars to Dhutis, all of this make the characters and the settings very uniquely indigenized. Now, the conclusions also, very importantly, the conclusions. There are stories where Byomkesh is not punishing the criminal, he's letting them go, right? At the same time, there are stories where he's very harsh on the criminals. But you see, he's applying a certain sense of moral discretion within the stories. If you see Prafullo Roy, who is a murderer and who kills on request, is seen as an artist by Byomkesh because he has developed this contraption of the cycle bell which fires gramophone pins. These are all very interesting motives. He's somewhere sympathizes with the criminal. In this particular case where, this riot victim is let go. Probal, for example, I'm sorry, in one of these stories, on Independence Day, somebody is let go. So there are certain discretions that Byomkesh applies in the short stories. So the morality is not really so watertight, although I would say apprehending the criminal and finding out the truth is something which he talks about. Now, I've also talked about the times of the indigenization of the narratives, the interaction between the paranormal and the detective story. Shoilo Rahosyo becomes very crucial in this way, the mountain mystery, where the ghost provides, as it were, a clue to not the ghost really, but there's something supernatural which sort of makes Byomkesh find out a scrap of paper where the final address of the criminal is located. There's a lot of humor also in the Byomkesh stories, which gives it an unique indigenous style. There's a lot of humor directed at Ajit also. Now, this is not merely in the Byomkesh Bakshi stories. We also find certain references to the Watson stories, the Holmes stories as well. But something that is very unique in terms of indigenization is this question of gender. Now, there are very few female criminals in Byomkesh. I can think of room number 2, and where the doctor, the lady doctor, becomes the murderer with her scissors, and she murders this scarred man because he has led to the death of his daughter. But murder is seen as essentially male, and the women in the Byomkesh households, the women characters in the Byomkesh households are either femme fatales or very domestic or quarrelsome wives, but very rarely do they actually commit any crime, right? Therefore, in a certain sense, I would suggest that this question of detective fiction is being cast squarely into the bahir, into the outside world, into the public sphere, whereas the domestic sphere is largely spared from any kind of violence. Now, this was obviously not true. Now, we don't have stories where people kill their wives very much, or there's a lot of criminal activity being practiced by women. Now, therefore, in terms of gender, I would say Sharadindu is indigenizing the detective story in a certain way. There's no master woman criminal in Byomkesh Bakshi stories as Irene Adler in Sherlock Holmes, or for that matter, in the Agatha Christie stories, where women very often use poison as a method of killing. And there's one last point that I would like to mention, because it's already 10 o'clock, is the language of the Byomkesh Bakshi stories. if you read them in Bengali, then you will find that they are written in a mixture of the Sadhu and the Cholit, the pure and the spoken language. So the narration is by Ajit in the Sadhu Bhasha, in the purer language, whilst the interaction of the people, the talking of the people is in the more common parlance. Therefore, this admixture of the Sadhu and the Cholit creates the detective fiction as a kind of a hybrid form, which exists on the fringes of the literary and the non-literary, of the popular and the serious, of the again of the pure and the impure. Which brings me, of course, to the final comment that I will make: the term Shottanneshi, the truth seeker. Byomkesh says, and Ajit asks, why Shottanneshi? Why not any other word? Byomkesh says, detective is very Western. Amar bhalo lage na. Goenda tiktiki is somebody who is extremely shady. Therefore, truth seeker. Now, that title which is given in your translation is inquisitor. Now, I don't like this. Inquisition is somebody who finds something out through a lot of questions. In that sense, yes, the detective questions. But the inquisitor is somebody also who is associated in medieval parlance with witch hunting, with a lot of finding out who is uttering heresy and not, and therefore associated with a lot of religious persecution. The detective is an inquisitor only in the sense that he asks a lot of questions and searches for the truth. So when you read the translation, I would suggest that a better translation would be the seeker of truth. In that sense, the Indian tradition, within the Indian tradition, truth has been something which has always been sought, not only in the English tradition, of course, in the Indian tradition. All philosophy is the search for truth and beauty. And I would say in the term Byomkesh, Shiv Satyam Shivam Sundaram, there's ultimately Byomkesh is the seeker of truth who comes from an ancestry of Eastern logic and uses copiously Western logic as well. So in the Byomkesh Bakshi name and in the term Shottanneshi, I would suggest that, and within the detective form, Sharadindu is bringing in a lot of traditions together, and truth seeker, I would say, would be a better translation than the inquisitor. What have I tried to suggest? I've tried to suggest that detective fiction was a form that came from English literature into Bengali literature and Indian literature. One. Secondly, that Kolkata and the metropolis became the source of economic activity and a lot of criminal culture, sensational crimes. Three, there was a rise of print culture which promoted the periodicals and therefore the popular culture of which detective fiction would be part. Four, that Sharadindu uses the detective stories from a lot of Western sources, but originally rewrites them, adapts them into separate forms of literature. Finally, he's conscious that these stories are on the fringes of literature and popular culture. And finally, in terms of theme, location, the choice of the detective, the use of gender and language, and the use of narratives of the paranormal, Sharadindu succeeds in transforming what is essentially a Western form into an indigenous, specifically suited to Bengali society, and emerges, and the stories emerge as testaments of contemporary history with their combination of social literature, with historical fiction, romances, and of course, paranormal literature. It is in this, I would say, it is in this complexity, in these intermixing of forms and traditions, that Sharadindu's stories attain significance within the canon of Bengali literature. It is with that I bring my discussion to a close. If you have time and if you do not have any more classes right now, I would be glad to take a few questions.
দাদা পথের
পথের কাঁটা, হ্যাঁ
হ্যাঁ পথের কাঁটাটা কি ওই ডেলি বাসুমতি ওইটাতে কি প্রকাশ হয়েছিল?
হ্যাঁ, বসুমতী
1930
পত্রিকা 1932 ফার্স্ট বোমকেশ স্টোরি।
আর সেকেন্ড ডেটটা কি বলেছিলেন?
সীমন্ত হীরা, বসুমতী পত্রিকা কিন্তু এটা। হ্যাঁ,
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা, হ্যাঁ।
Shimonto Hira. Third is actually the Shottanneshi, where Byomkesh is trying to, where Sharadindu is trying to establish or introduce the Byomkesh character to his readers, trying to create a character who will be part and parcel of. Actually, I should have mentioned this 33 stories that he had written and one unwritten story. He died exactly in September 1970. So 50 years earlier. The story which he could not complete was Bishupal Bod. Right. I am sure you will have a few questions because Byomkesh stories are known to all of you. I suggest you go back today and listen to this discussion. And we will take up the Shottanneshi of the Inquisitor, as it is titled, or the Truth Seeker, whatever you call it, tomorrow. And we will definitely have an open session where your questions, based on any other detective story on Byomkesh, I will answer. The two stories I have chosen are Shottanneshi or the Truth Seeker, which because it gives us the idea of the Byomkesh Ajit friendship and is technically the first story in the canon. And I have chosen Byomkesh of Borodas so that I can trace the interface between detective fiction and ghost writing and the writing of ghost stories and see them as kinds of binaries. Right? It is with this logic that I have taken two, because I think more than two would be a little too heavy. But, right. Okay, shall I bring this class to a close then? With your permission, I am therefore stopping the recording, and let me say how much I've enjoyed preparing myself for this class and discussing this with you, although discussions haven't happened, but I'm sure they will. Thank you.